AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner.
Hey, Gary.
John, how are you?
Oh, I am so glad to be back doing Autoline After Hours. I missed last week and missed the show.
You missed it. We missed you. It was a lively one, and I hope the audience enjoyed it. I know that the participants did. Let's just put it that way, so we won't go further than that. So before we start the show, November 9th is a rather important date in history. I'm not going to quiz you on what it was, but so a little backstory here. In 1946, after World War II, Robert McNamara joined the Ford Motor Company in the planning department. Okay. So here's Robert McNamara, and he's working very hard. And on November 9th, 1960, Henry Ford II resigned the presidency of Ford Motor Company, named himself the CEO, and remained being chairman. So now after all of these years, Robert McNamara becomes only the second person in the history of the company who wasn't a Ford family member to be the president of Ford. The first one was this guy named John S. Gray, who was from 1903 to 1906. He basically was the guy who put in the money that made the Ford Motor Company exist. So here's McNamara. After all these years, becomes president. Okay. Now, on November 8th, 1960, John Kennedy was elected president of the United States. 5 weeks after McNamara became the president of the Ford Motor Company, he resigned and became the Secretary of Defense.
That's right.
So just imagine you have this whole career, then suddenly become president, and it's like, okay, thank you, goodbye.
Right. Yeah. And he probably made a lot more money as president of Ford than he did as defense secretary.
Yes, and as Secretary of Defense, he was a rather controversial figure, which one of our guests today, Mr. Todd Lassa, who is a contributing editor of Auto Week, probably knows far more about Mr. McNamara than we would even want to know.
I wish I knew a lot more than I did. I'm not quite as taken aback by that name as you thought. I will say that if you haven't watched it, and I haven't watched it in many years, but rent Errol Morris's documentary where he interviews Robert McNamara, and it came out on the big screen and then the small screen not long before McNamara died. But it's a good it's worth looking up that documentary.
And our very special guest, Jeff Schuster, who's the group head and executive vice president of Automotive at Global Data. So welcome, Jeff.
Great to be with you guys.
Yeah. Actually, I think, Jeff, each time you've come on the show, you've been at a company with a different name, even though it's still the same company.
Yeah, I think we've had a few iterations, as a few others in the industry have gone through as well. So yeah, I guess it's just our turn this time.
Yeah, that's right.
So Jeff, recently you wrote, and I will quote you to you, the outlook for 2024 has been increased slightly to 92 million units, a 4% increase from 2023. This is global numbers, of course. Volatility and risk remain elevated given the number of variables that are currently affecting auto sales globally. Talk to us about the volatility and risk that we've seen in 23 so far and what you see moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, I think from a volatility standpoint, you have to look to the UAW strike, and I'm sure we'll talk a little more about that later, but that obviously in the US is impacting things. The biggest thing globally is pricing. Certainly keeping consumers on the sidelines in a lot of different markets around the world. Now, having said that, if we go back to where we were at the beginning of the year to where we are now in the outlook for the year, getting closer, so it's a little easier to fortune tell the end of the year now. But things have improved. The market, really the global market, even though there's a lot of risk, the global market has outperformed expectations at the level that we're at right now. So I think that's the good news story. The consumers despite all of that pricing pressure, be it actual cost of a vehicle plus the rise in interest rates that occurred throughout the year, it really has impacted where autos should be in this recovery. But in addition to that, if we look at the other side of it, there's still a level of disruption from a supply standpoint, much less than we saw last year or even the previous year. But we still are dealing with some other disruptions and shortages of parts that the industry is working through. So that's really the setup, I think, as we look at 2024. A little bit better feel for things going forward and expecting a continued recovery, but nonetheless, there's still volatility and risk ahead.
So why is it doing better than expected, and where? I mean, we know the U.S. sales are up. I know Europe's been doing pretty good too.
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
No. Well, what about the rest of the world?
It's really a similar story, John. I think when we look at where we expected Europe, and I would split it between Western and Eastern Europe. Obviously, war in Ukraine has impacted that market, but the market has shown improvement from the beginning when it started. And I think if you look at Western Europe, again, outperforming expectations. Parts of the ASEAN market are doing well. We're looking at China. China's been a market that was expected to see a little more pronounced pullback. Now there's a unique situation there. They're having a little bit of a price war, and that's, I think, certainly helping volume there. So maybe the price is a different type of a driver when we look at the Chinese market right now, domestically anyway. And their exports have been off the charts this year, mainly going to Russia and replenishing the vehicle market there with all the global OEMs that have exited there. So it really is a story of good performance in a relatively healthy vehicle market around the world in most of the major markets.
But you mentioned pricing, right? And I mean, that's one of the things that we wanted to get into on today's show is, everywhere I go, people complain about the price of cars. I mean, everywhere I go. And what's the impact on pricing that you think? I mean, we've seen such a skyrocketed increase in prices ever since COVID and the chip shortage. And I guess it's abated somewhat, but I mean, prices are still sky high.
They are. They're still at record highs, even though they may have pulled back a little bit. But it's certainly prohibitive to some consumers. It pushed many consumers out of the new car market and has fueled the used car market as well, because they've either decided to buy their lease and just hold it, repair their existing vehicle, or venture into the used car market. So it's been a challenging environment for the consumer, and while it is easing a bit, I certainly don't expect things to go back to where they were. I think we're going to deal with the elevated pricing. There's a few other drivers to that as we transition further to EVs. The price associated with those, obviously costs are another factor that plays a role here as we look at the market going forward, at least over the near to midterm.
Jeff, I've been Gary and have heard me say this way too often over the years that brand new cars are becoming are out of reach for most middle class. That they're becoming they've become an upper middle class and more type of purchase, and that was even before the big jump from an ATP of about $30,000 to $40,000, and then now close to $50,000 today.
Right.
So is there, if that is the market, if you agree with that, and please tell me if you don't, does that mean that the market, that maybe part of this kind of exuberance for the market as it is today has to do with the fact that people who are pretty well off comparatively to the middle class and are maybe less affected by interest rates and all those other factors, maybe that's what's driving the continued demand in Europe, in Western Europe, and in the U.S.
Yeah, no, Todd, I think there's absolutely some truth to that. certainly you're looking at a market. When we say you've shrunk the market, you've really created essentially a premium market from a price standpoint. And I think that market is behaving much like the premium market subset does, and that is those buyers tend to be insulated from some of the noise and some of the risks that have occurred, and they're less impacted by the inflationary pressure, not obviously just in the vehicle market, but in everything you buy that we've all dealt with. I think there's also a level of conditioning here where we've become accustomed to waiting for things. We've become accustomed to higher prices. And as those ease, I think you'll see some buyers that are able to come back in or will just come back in. But I think when you look at the longer term implications of this, if pricing doesn't come down, you've probably shrunk the new car market permanently. And that brings up a whole lot of potential issues when you look at capacity, too much out there. So this spins out of control potentially if we don't see pricing move down or other creative ways to get buyers into vehicles.
Well, look, and during the pandemic, during the huge supply shortage, when automakers were, especially in the U.S., were putting their precious few chips into the most expensive, highest margin cars, Cadillacs instead of Chevys, they found that they were able to maintain or increase their profits on a quarterly, yearly basis. So, why switch back? Why go back?
Well, that's it. I think during that was a lesson, obviously, out of COVID. I think a lot of the manufacturers realize, let's stop chasing volume, and margin is where it's at, and you can make a lot of money on a higher margin vehicle and with less volume. And I think that's likely what one of the outcomes of the pandemic is, and that is a smaller market going forward. Unless there's some major movement on pricing or getting things under control, where you really open it up, it's going to be really challenging, I think, in some of the emerging markets around the world to really get on that growth train that a lot of us, we've been talking about markets like India, which has done fairly well and continues to improve. But I think the challenge there is as you start to introduce technology and electrification and other things that have a higher cost, you're again going to be shrinking that possible pool of buyers.
Well, I think one thing, the only thing that I see that could bring down prices, certainly in the U.S. market, was we just saw that comment pop up from one of our viewers, Mark Potachnik. I hope I didn't butcher your name too bad, of saying, hey, the $12,000 BYD Seagull is going to clean up. I mean, we can get into the UAW stuff too, but Jeff, I don't see anything bringing down car prices, nothing whatsoever, unless the Chinese come in with much lower price cars.
Yeah, I would agree, John. I think it's going to take a major cost or technology breakthrough that gets us a much cheaper vehicle to produce, and I just don't see that happening at least for a few years. I suppose these things are hard to predict anyway, but without something like that or a Chinese low-cost vehicle coming in, and then I would question, is that a one-time purchase and then you don't want to go back to it? I guess it just depends on the quality and how well that vehicle is able to last in the market.
But Jeff, are you talking here about EVs or ICE vehicles? Because there are certainly affordable ICE vehicles.
There are.
So it would seem to me that this whole issue of affordability is in some ways addressed by Corollas and Civics and things like that.
Yeah, it certainly could be. Obviously, that's not the focus of the manufacturers right now. And again, as we move towards an electrified market, and we can debate the speed of that, because I think the indication is probably slower than what most thought. But I think as that happens, that's just additional pricing pressure. So there are ways to mitigate that, and that is ICE vehicles stay around longer. You develop a lower cost EV that can play in that entry level space, because there really isn't one in the US anyway. at this point, and or some combination of the two. And right now, the focus really is on those larger, high-priced vehicles that drive margin, and that's not necessarily good for those buyers that can't afford them, obviously.
I wonder too whether the Chinese really want to bring those low-cost vehicles into the U.S. market. I mean, just like Hyundai and Kia pushing up market after they had some ups and downs with entry-level cars in the 90s, quality issues, and the Japanese for that matter. I mean, I think the Chinese want to come in maybe with a relatively affordable EV, but nothing below, say, $30,000 MSRP.
Yeah, I think that's potentially a slippery slope for them, because as you mentioned, that we saw what happened initially with the launch of the Japanese brands in the US. The Korean brands had a similar issue. The Chinese have had an experience with launching, call it affordable, maybe cheap's a little too harsh, but affordable vehicles in South America, Brazil as an example, and buyers that took a chance on it, bought the vehicle, it broke down, then they couldn't get parts. So there's all kinds of issues related to that. And consumers don't forget. Would take a generation or a new buyer to come in and not have that bad taste from an experience like that. So I would agree. I'm not sure that would be the first forte into the U.S. market from a Chinese brand. It may come later when it's been proven, or they've established the brand first. But I think you're likely to see the higher end products come in because they want margin as well.
I think it would vary by company, though. So, I'd expect the Neo to come in and be upper priced because that's the market that they play in. And I could see other Chinese brands coming in dirt cheap and just cleaning up, taking over the bottom end of the market.
There isn't a low end market right now. So, yeah, I think there's definitely an opportunity there if someone were to come in and do it right.
Well, but the low end of the market is our off-lease certified used cars, 3 years old, right? I mean, that given that the average age of a car in the U.S. is 11 or 12 years or whatever it's up to now, cars last a lot longer. 3 years old is not what a 3-year-old car was in the 1970s.
Absolutely, yeah.
I thought it was interesting, speaking of margins, that when you hear the rhetoric from most OEMs about their electric future, it's electric for everybody, right? And we're not seeing this for everybody, and someday we will. But yesterday, the CEO of Polestar, which is sort of a startup, right? The Geely owned spin out of Volvo, which Geely owns, Thomas Ingelheath said, and I quote, "Margin over volume is our way forward, supported by a gorgeous lineup of 4 exclusive performance cars." So here's a guy who's basically saying, okay, we're just going after margin globally. We got 4 cars. We're not going to build very many of them, but we're going to get enough margin on them to make money. And I just like, wow, that's so refreshing. This guy's being honest about what's actually going on.
No, it is. And I think you'll find a lot of focus and strategies are on margin now. So this plays into that. And it plays into that issue of pricing remaining a potential headwind for the volume and for the consumer.
So where do you see things going, especially with in the U.S. with this UAW contract? I mean, the Detroit 3 now have to pay much higher labor costs, but it looks like that's pulling everybody else up with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we saw some of the actions that have taken place already, and I suspect we'll see more of that. It essentially is raising the costs to produce a vehicle. So that's got to go somewhere. It's likely to go to the suppliers and likely to go to the consumers. So I think, certainly that there's going to be some implications to how that plays a role in this issue of lower volume as well.
But Jeff, are the Detroit 3 really going to be able to pass on these labor costs? I think it's going to be possible in the heavy duty pickup segment because they don't face any international competition, not even Toyota's in that segment, at least not yet. So they got that segment to themselves, but everywhere else, can you really price a a Ford Explorer that much above, say, a Toyota Highlander or something like that, I just don't think the market's going to let you get away with it.
No, I think competition will keep things in check, clearly. And that's why I think supply base better be ready for some pain, because I think that's likely where it's headed.
I wonder, because
ready for pain.
Okay, more pain.
Exactly, Gary. Exactly. I mean,
how much more can they take, right?
How much more can they take? And if you're talking, the big multinational tier ones, maybe they can lean on them. But you get into some of these smaller suppliers, and they're at their wits' end already. I don't even see them agreeing to price cuts whatsoever. They just the opposite. They want more, as they call it, economics.
Yeah. And I think I was just going to say, I think that's an issue. I think when you look at this, you could potentially make have suppliers make a decision to opt out of supplying vehicles, and that also applies some pressure and some risk, I think, certainly to the manufacturers. So a lot of moving pieces here for sure. They're not all, or I should say, they're all pointing to pricing problems, I think, when we look forward.
See, where I think it's going to come out of is OEM margins.
Yeah.
That's where I think we're going to see the biggest hit, not on suppliers, not on prices for consumers, because I don't think they're going to be able to get away with it. I think it's going to go hit them right in their margins.
John, that's another reason to sell $49,000 cars instead of $30,000.
Yeah, exactly.
And John, I mean, aren't the OEMs focused primarily on their margins? I mean, looking at what Tesla's margin is and going, oh my God, we got to do something like that.
Yeah, well, Tesla's playing its lower cost card. Tesla can make an EV far cheaper than certainly any of the Western automakers can. And it's still very competitive in China. I mean, it kicked off the price war in China. And, this was very deliberate. They kicked this off before they started to see really a drop in volume. And they're forcing a lot of others to play the game. Although it's very interesting, BMW has said, screw that. We're not cutting our margins. Lucid has sort of said that, but they've cut prices too. But, if you've got the market demand, you can hold steady. If you've got the brand cachet, you can hold steady. But others are going to have to cut prices.
Well, and if you're building EVs, you want to keep them under $66,000 for a car, and $80,000 for a truck or SUV, right? To get that $7,500 tax credit,
right?
Whether you're able to afford it or not, you don't want to buy an EV without getting that tax credit.
Without the tax credit, yeah.
Let me ask though. Speaking about the UAW contracts and big raises, the higher wages involved, pretty much since the Japanese and Europeans have been assembling cars in the U.S., mostly in the South, they mostly try to keep their employees' wages near the UAW levels, keep the UAW out. So what do you see happening going forward now that these new contracts are going to be in place with the imports, with their wages for their employees at U.S. factories?
Well, I suspect we'll see more of what we've seen already, and that is the nudging up of those wages for that exact purpose. Now, I think the wild card here is, will the UAW, coming off of this, I'll call it a win for them, coming off of this win,
big win,
right? Will they have some success in maybe moving into these other manufacturers that they haven't had success in before? So that'll be an interesting play. They're definitely gonna give it a go. So I think, to preempt that, I would expect to see some wages increase again, to try to keep the workers happy before that were to happen.
And that would ease the disadvantage we were talking about regarding the new UAW contracts.
Right.
Yeah, Toyota's already announced that it's going to raise wages, and others are probably either looking at doing it or have done it and haven't said anything about it. But that's what they've been doing for the last 40 years anyway.
Right.
But I think I think Sean Fain's going after them.
I think
and
so
it'll be
too.
Interesting who's going to be his first target. Is it going to be Tesla? I don't know. Is it going to be Toyota? I think Toyota is a very likely one. And the others that I've wondered about are the Germans, Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen, who have plants in the U.S. And the reason I say that is, as you guys all know, back at headquarters in Germany, half the supervisory board has got to be labor. Yes. And by law in Germany, you have to have a works council at each and every one of your plants. And oh, by the way, works councils are illegal in the United States. So, I would think that the union might have more leverage with the supervisory. The UAW could have leverage with the supervisory boards of saying, hey, what is this? Even your plants in China are unionized. Your plants in Mexico are unionized. They're not unionized in the U.S., so get with the program.
John, the issue here then becomes, Volkswagen kind of welcomed it when they built their Chattanooga plant. And what the UAW will be up against is not Volkswagen or even Toyota, but those southern states and the politicians who want to keep unions out.
Keep them out. Yep.
Well, John, we heard an interesting one yesterday that you didn't mention, Rivian.
Yeah.
And now just think about that. It's in an area that isn't far south. They've got some, concerns in terms of ramping up their production. It's a startup company. If Shawn Fain were to be able to get, his foot in the door of an EV startup company and unionize that, I mean, I think that would go a long, long way.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, Gary, and you're exactly right, because the Rivian plant in Bloomington, Normal, Illinois, former UAW plant, there might be a lot of people in that region. I don't even know if they're working at the plant, but there could be a lot of pro-UAW sympathy there.
That'd
be really interesting, I think.
Yeah. So to me, I think this is going to be the big story of 2024. I mean, things always change, right? But, sitting here towards the end of 23, I think the union making a move to start organizing the transplants and the EV startups is going to be a huge story. And, I looked up some of the numbers. There's about 13 or 14 transplants plus EV startups. I'm counting Tesla, Lucid, Rivian. They have 25 manufacturing facilities. We're talking big manufacturing complexes. They're building more. They're soon going to go to 30. They employ around 128,000 hourly workers, all of whom are non-union. So 128,000. There's about 142,000 UAW true auto workers. I'm not counting, college TA, teaching assistants or casino workers or whoever else the UAWs organize. So, I mean, for Shawn Fain, that is a lot of membership. I mean, he could almost double his automotive membership if he could get those workers.
And it appears he is certainly going to make that ploy. I think you're right, John. I think we're going to be talking a lot more about this in 2024.
Yeah.
I just am wondering. So if the non-traditional OEMs raise their prices or raise their wages to their employees, which would possibly mean they raise their prices, would there still be a proportionate advantage that they would have over the traditional three?
Yes. I mean, like I said, ever since the union first made a run, I think it was at Honda or something like that. I'm going, this goes back to the early 80s and failed. Honda raised their wages. And I remember the former head of purchasing at BMW telling me that he felt that instead of building their plant in South Carolina, they should have built it in Michigan. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, well, number one, we have to pay almost UAW wages just to keep the union out. So, I mean, even going, back several decades ago, the whole thinking with the transplants coming here was pay them just enough to keep the union out.
Jeff, you made a very interesting point earlier about, one of the consequences of higher prices for vehicles, and that suddenly the footprint that any auto company has that is now making, looking at margins. So the volume goes down, but you have this big manufacturing footprint that you no longer need. How do you see this playing out in the next 5 years or so?
Well, I think that is going to be something to keep an eye on. Utilizations are not where they were. They're not at a healthy level right now. Yeah, part of that is due to pandemic related recovery that we're still in. But again, if we get back up and top out at 16 and a half, somewhere in that range, instead of the 17 and a half, we already are sitting on too much capacity, especially if you look at this transition that's occurring as well. And you're converting some plants, you're building new plants, but you're not getting rid of anything. And it's not just a US issue, it's a global issue. From a utilization standpoint, globally, we're right around 60%. 65%. And that's not sustainable. And we're, we as an industry, I say we collectively are continuing to build new factories that are state-of-the-art electrified factories. And you've got a lot of old capacity that's still out there that is you're going to need to deal with it. And I think that's going to add another cost if it's not dealt with or can't be dealt with because maybe of labor contracts or other concerns. That's another cost factor when you're running efficiency or inefficient plants, building only a few thousand vehicles, maybe in a capacity of over 100,000 or 200, 300,000. Yeah, that's a problem. And I think that's something, again, the industry hasn't dealt with yet and is going to rear its ugly head at some point.
Hey, and let's get into more detail on that, but we got to take a quick commercial break right now.
How do Bridgestone tires stop shorter on wet roads? It's their HydroTrack technology. But you don't have to know how the science works, just where the brake is. What really matters is they're Bridgestone.
All right. Thank you, Bridgestone and Borg-Warner, for that. So, sort of to recap what we were talking about and launching off into the future, all the automakers, Gary, you made this point, well, that are pushing for better profit margins. But now we've got higher labor costs, certainly in the United States, interest rates putting pressure on consumers. Volume is up, but not quite as good. And Jeff, you left us off in the first segment saying the industry's operating at 60% capacity. As you said it's not sustainable. I'll say it's a disaster. I mean, because you need rule of thumb, you need 80% capacity utilization or you're not making money. And so that I think is going to put even more pressure to not build affordable cars and go more upmarket where you can really make some money. And that'll be fine for the people who are in the market because they've got the money to buy those cars. $700 a month payment, $800 a month payment, whatever. They've got the money to do it. But they're going to buy expensive vehicles that then have to go into the used car market. Are middle-class Americans going to be able to afford even those cars? What do you think, Jeff?
I honestly really question it. I think there's a good portion of the middle class that probably won't be able to afford them. And I suppose that's great for the repair industry because that's likely what's going to happen is people are going to sit on their vehicles longer than they are today already. And I think it's putting additional pressure on that new car market that, right now, as we're talking, I'm getting more depressed about. And I thought our forecast we cut our forecast globally by about 7.5 million units for this reason. And I'm wondering if maybe we need to cut it more.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned, John, you mentioned Lucid before, and Lucid came out with their Q3 numbers this week. So they only lost $631 million, which was $40 million less than they lost in Q3 last year. But then to the point, Jeff, that you were making about having these large plants that are not making very many cars. So Lucid, which does have a factory in Casa Grande, Arizona, announced that they weren't going to build 10,000 cars this year. They were going to adjust it down to maybe 8.5. Okay, so it's like you have this big plant, you're not making anything. So then they decided, well, we'll cut the prices of our vehicles by about 10 grand. I mean, what does this say about the possibility of some of these startups just completely running out of juice?
Oh, we obviously we've seen that happen already to a few of them, and I suspect it will do one of two things, if not both, and that is it will probably put some other ones out of business, because this is a long game, and you can't continue to bleed cash like that and survive. So you've got that issue. It'll probably also prevent some others from trying to come into the market for that same reason. You've got to really bankroll this for 10 to 15 years. And I think that's a real challenge for any new startup today.
I'd say almost impossible. You know, I went back and started digging through Tesla's numbers and tried to figure out, when did they really start making a profit? Because as you guys know, Tesla lost money for over a decade. They lost billions of dollars, but they turned the corner in mid 2019 when they started building and selling 80,000 cars a quarter. And what really got them there was the Model 3. And in mid Q3 2019, they built and sold 50,000 Model 3s. And boom, that's what put them over the top. And they've never looked back since. So to me, you know, different automakers are going to have different overhead costs and things like that, different break-even points, and depends where you price the vehicle. But I think an easy rule of thumb is, until everybody else is able to sell 50,000 units a quarter, that's about 17,000 a month. Okay. So you need to sell 17,000 of the same vehicle from the same plant to be able to start making money. And no one's even close to that.
And you're talking globally, John, right? Because Tesla never breaks out its U.S. numbers.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Todd. And, you know, scale is all about how many you build. It doesn't matter where you sell them. You just have to be able to, you know, build that many so that you can amortize your sunk cost over that many more units, where it overcomes your variable cost, and voila, you've got a profit at the end of the day.
But John, isn't it interesting that they had the Model S expensive, they had the Model X expensive, then they come with that car, which is affordable. And so it's sort of saying, okay, if you want to sell a lot, make it something that a lot of people can buy.
Right.
So why are they building the Cybertruck first and not the small entry level hatchback that Elon Musk talks about every quarterly earnings report?
Well, they're working on it. I mean, they're building a plant in Mexico that supposedly is going to be what people are calling the Model 2. But, you know, it also came out recently that they're going to build a 25,000 euro car at their plant in Berlin. So we'll see. But I mean, Tesla's juggling a lot of balls in the air all at once. I think the Cybertruck program has been something of a disaster for them. Yeah. You know, I talked to a production supplier earlier this summer, and he said, the place is nuts. He says, you know, they keep changing the direction of the program. And I, meaning the supplier guy I was talking to, he says, like every 6 months, I'm dealing with somebody new. They've transferred that person out someplace else. So to me, it sounds like that program's been, you know, something of a disaster.
Well, and Musk talked about that on the Q3
earnings. Yeah.
Well, he said we dug our own grave.
He's discovered that building cars and trucks is hard. Which I think he's mentioned a few times before.
He may have mentioned that a couple of times.
Yeah, but you know, it's true. But look, you know, they've hit home runs with the Model 3 and the Model Y. Home runs, and they're revolutionizing the manufacturing of the industry. And this new assembly process could take it even farther. We'll see. They still got to prove it, but it's intriguing what they're doing.
No, it is. It is, and I think just on top of that, John, when you talk about getting to that scale, getting to that 50,000 unit scale, or whatever the number might be, and it's going to be different for different brands that are positioning themselves in a certain way. But I think when we look at what they did, and that is high-priced vehicles established, and obviously has a cult following, but established an image of desirable, something you aspire to own. I want to own a Tesla. And I think then you take it to the mainstream from a pricing standpoint, and again, using those affordable air quotes, I think that was brilliant, and it has worked for them. Be interesting to see if others try to follow that as they move into a more mainstream electrified products.
They did what everybody said GM should have done with the Chevy Volt, not Bolt, the extended range car. They should have done the Cadillac version first, made the money, money on that, and then do the Chevy Volt. Jeff, I have to ask. So, if indeed this concentration on profit margin over volume takes hold and keeps hold, what happens in 5-10 years? Do we lose brands? Do we lose entire automakers? Will there be, 6 or 8 majors instead of the 10 or 12 we have now? What does the automotive lineup look like in 5 or 10 years?
It's a great question, Todd. I think I think if we play this out, if that all holds and margins hold, pricing is there, and the market shrinks or stays at the level that it's at, I think you're likely looking at consolidation in the industry to survive, essentially. So it'll probably push some out, just because they aren't able to essentially get to the scale that is able to get margin. And then I think there'll be some proactive moves, likely in some other type of consolidation, M&As, joining forces, however, partnerships, it could be actual acquisitions. So I think it could spur the next wave of that consolidation in the industry.
Hey, look how successful Stellantis has been. A merger of Fiat, Chrysler, and Peugeot. I mean, Carlos Tavares is something of a magician. He turned around Opel in almost no time. So to me, Stellantis is going to be the model of what we're probably going to see more of.
But will Stellantis be able to keep Fiat in the long run? What about Alfa Romeo or even Dodge? I mean, that's what I'm wondering. Both within the corporations and then the corporations themselves. I mean, there's going to be some fallout there.
Yeah, I think that's very possible that you'll see, not only you see a consolidation as in acquisitions or like a Stellantis, but it's also very possible that you will see some tough decisions being made within those large corporations that could lead to brands or vehicle lines that are no longer. So we have a lot of choice out there right now. And obviously, we're in that phase of, we have a lot of ICE choice, and we're getting a lot of electrified choices now, and we'll even see a lot more of those. But I think as we work through that, the end game here could be fewer choices. And again, you can get efficiencies in a different way by streamlining that.
Well, certainly fewer affordable choices, right?
Yeah. Well, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting, picking up on what you're saying there, Todd, because Tavares has told all the brands, and they got a lot of them. I mean, there's like 14 brands in the group or something like that. And he's told them, hey, I'm not killing off any brands. I'm giving you a decade, and we're going to fund you guys to come out with new product. Then it's up to you. And but you bet he'll take an axe to whoever doesn't perform.
Volkswagen is the new, Stellantis is the new Volkswagen, the new old GM, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's certainly some parallels there.
So, Jeff, when you talk about being a reduction in the number or possible consolidation of companies, I mean, are you talking brand name companies or, small, like we saw Lotus become part of Geely? I mean, who cares, right?
Right. I think if we follow this and all of these things happen in the way that leads to a smaller vehicle market, yeah, I think everything's on the table. So I think we could see some well-known brands either consolidate or significantly change their footprint in really what their brand is.
Or do you know, some suggestions have been made. Maybe your brand is only 3 models.
Yeah.
And so you don't get rid of the brand per se,
Right.
but you just shrink down the model line.
Shrink the model line and the complexity. Yep.
Chrysler has already pretty much done that in the last many years.
That's right.
Yeah. Except for Jeep. Jeep's everything.
Well, you know, even Jeep is struggling now, though. And, you know, I, as I've said before, I'm amazed the industry let Jeep get away with it for so long without going after them. But, you know, look what the Bronco has done to Jeep sales. It really put the whammy on it.
So, Jeff, you were saying earlier that, you know, we're on this path toward electrification, and that is certain inevitability to that happening. And, you know, we're seeing, you know, tremendous investments being made by traditional automakers in terms of, you know, getting the capacity to, you know, build the vehicles, build the batteries. And it seems that we're beginning to see evidence that the market isn't necessarily there for EVs in a way that even a year ago people were talking about. Oh, we passed a tipping point. Now it's going to be a hockey stick, and we're going to be selling all kinds of these vehicles.
Right.
You know, what is the challenge that the OEMs have in terms of, you know, on the one hand, maintaining their affordable ICE vehicles, even though they may be like, you know, $70,000, $80,000 Tahoes, and, you know, having the wherewithal to make these big investments that is necessary for them to get to this electrified future.
Yeah, it's a massive challenge for them, for the industry as a whole, if this doesn't move down the path that they all are planning on. So right now that Tahoe's paying the bills, obviously, and paying for the investment into EVs. But at some point, this has got to flip, and you'll hit a point of no return. We're not there yet, because obviously there's still a significant amount of ICE capacity and vehicle choices out there, but that will start going away on this path. I think there's a lot. You know, we've been talking about this internally within our group, but also just across the industry. And I think everyone's kind of on board with there's a lot to be solved yet before you hit mainstream consumers. And then you question, are the early adopters, have we satisfied most of the early adopters? And how do you transition? And it comes down to what we've been talking about today, and that's price. It comes down to convenience. So the infrastructure, the charging, and then ultimately, what do you do with the battery and the range of the vehicle? So those are still, and we've been talking about that for a long time, right? This is 10 years, longer than 10 years. And those 3 issues still remain. And yes, they've improved. We've seen improvements in those areas, and some countries are better than others, certainly at infrastructure, for example. But I think that's the problem with this. And especially if you're a traditional manufacturer that is making that transition from ICE to electrified, and you're making that investment, you're changing your factories over. If the volume and scale isn't there from a consumer standpoint, that's a huge risk. And we're seeing some of the implications of that with the dialing back of production, you know, whether it's Ford, some programs being delayed or cut, joint ventures that have decided to hold off on producing vehicles. There's a lot at stake here in this transition. And I think it's probably going to go a little slower than we all thought.
Yeah, but I agree with you totally there, Jeff. The problem for the industry is, of course, there's laws on the book that says thou shalt sell this percentage of EVs by the end of the decade.
Yep, absolutely. And that's it. You've got the regs are all there. You've got the investment, and the manufacturers said, okay, well, they tell us we have to do this, so we're going to do it. Somewhere along the way, the consumer's got to come along for the ride, and that's either going to be done forcefully or or through advancements in the technology and investment in the infrastructure. And I think that's really what's going to decide how quickly we end up getting there. I still don't think it's a question of will we get there unless something else comes along. And I don't think, fuel cells are always 10 years out. We've joked about that. And I think it's still the case, or maybe even longer. But unless something else pops in there, I think this is still at least the solution for the industry in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, look, I think you nailed it. It's scale and pricing, and set the infrastructure stuff aside for the moment. But Tesla's proved it can be done. BYD has proved that it can be done.
Yep.
I think the lessons are, how did they do it? And who can replicate that? And is the market big enough to absorb more than just Tesla and BYD right now?
And I think the BYD story is an interesting one because that is a manufacturer that pivoted and said, okay, and yeah, maybe they had a little more flexibility in doing so, but they went, all right, we're going all electric. And they weren't. So Tesla's a different story. They started that way. And I think obviously they have advantages in that because they were built to be an electric car company, but BYD was not, and now they are. And you're absolutely right. They're definitely eating up the Chinese market right now, and have aspirations elsewhere as well.
Right.
Well, Todd will probably disagree with this, but it seems to me that the phenomenon of Tesla is that Tesla has cachet that has been developed that would be exceedingly difficult for any traditional manufacturer to achieve. So even if they got scale, they still wouldn't be as special as Tesla is. And, in the case of BYD, here's a company that, China-based, that, developed its footprint, developed its manufacturing wherewithal to do that, advanced the technology. And, there was the government support for the new energy vehicles in the China market, which certainly helped them. So, I suppose that if somebody were faced with, you can buy a Tesla, or you can buy a BYD, or you can buy a Chevy, I think they'd opt for the Tesla if they had the opportunity.
I don't know that I disagree, Gary, with that. I mean, I think Wall Street is what is our collectively gave Tesla its cachet over the last 10 or 12 years. The talk, by the way, John mentioning regulations that will kind of force more EV production by the end of the decade reminded me of Bob Lutz and some of the other executives in Detroit arguing 20 years ago that we should get rid of CAFE and just hike up the federal gas tax to sell more fuel efficient cars and hybrids at the time and that sort of thing. Of course, that's impossible if you're in president or you're on Capitol Hill. You don't want to raise gas taxes and add to the inflationary spiral. But Detroit,
that's about as popular as talking about cutting, Social Security and stuff. It's the third rail of politics.
Yeah.
Right. Anybody who talks about anybody who talks about raising gas taxes will not have to worry about their next election.
That's right. That's right.
Well, and that would have been Bob Lutz, of course, circa 2002 or 3 or whatever.
But isn't there the possibility? I mean, we saw it in the UK where they said, okay, we're going to push back our ban of ICE vehicles until 2035, move it 5 years from 2030. I mean, politics is fluid. So, these regulations, I don't know, are, necessarily going to stick.
Well, especially depending on who wins election in 2024 and in 2026 in the midterms.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think that's a challenge for this industry that is trying to figure out what's the end game here? What do I need to, how do I get from here to the future here if it's electrified, and putting all this investment in for something that could get walked back. I suspect even if there's not a pivot on the policy, it's going to have to get walked back. We're not going to get there. We're just not going to get there. So I see no other choice. But again, if you're a vehicle manufacturer, you can't gamble everything on that, the likelihood that it's going to get walked back. You've got to march forward with what you know, and that's the reg as it is right now.
Right. And remember, what's driving all the regs is, concern about climate change.
Right.
And, we get a few more hurricanes and droughts and floods and fires. And, there's going to be a huge part of the population says, don't you dare back off on those regulations. So big fight coming over that.
The big fight, though, has already been going on, especially in oil producing states by big oil. I mean, that pushback is already coming on big time. And how do we tax EVs so that they pay for the roads the way the gasoline tax pays for the roads, that sort of thing.
Well, look, that's going to have to come anyway, because as cars get more, ICE vehicles get more fuel efficient, they're just going to use less fuel. And especially as we're talking about maybe if the car market plateaus, the states are going to have to find new ways to pay for roads, not just with gasoline taxes. And, this goes back decades. We've been talking about a per mile tax. So you get taxed by the number of miles you drive, and whether it's through electricity or gasoline or diesel doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think some level of creativity is going to be needed to solve that issue. And obviously there's a whole lot of attention in that area right now already. Probably another fight ahead, though, I imagine.
Right. Yeah, I mean, nothing's easy in life, right?
No.
And, these things that we've been talking about are prime examples of that. Hey, look, we're almost at the top of the hour. We probably ought to wrap up here. But Jeff Schuster, thanks so much for coming on. Really
Absolutely.
great to get your insights. Thanks, and your knowledge of the industry is terrific.
Appreciate that. Always enjoy chatting with you guys. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Great. Good. Todd, great seeing you again. Great having you back on the show.
Likewise. Thanks for having me back. I missed you guys.
Hey, that's great. And Gary, we'll be back at it next week.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner.
If you like this program and would like to learn more about the automotive industry, check out our website at autoline.tv or look for us on YouTube on the AutoLine channel.